How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. Today's episode of Liturgical Rebels is a special Earth Week episode as we celebrated Earth Day on April 22nd. I will be in conversation with Ruth Valerio, who has a particular interest in climate and environmental issues and longs to see the culture of the church change so that caring for the earth becomes an integral part of church life rather than an optional extra. My co-host for this episode will be Forrest Inslee, host of the Earth Keepers podcast. Ruth Valerio is currently Programs, Partnership and Advocacy Director for Embrace the Middle East, an organization that works to support Middle Eastern Christians as they tackle poverty and injustice in vulnerable and marginalized communities. Her previous roles include Global Advocacy and Influencing Director at Tear Fund UK and Churches and Theology Director for Arosha UK, an organisation that works for the protection and restoration of the natural world. At Arosha, she spearheaded Eco Church, which equips churches to care for God's world. She is also the co-founder of the Oikos Network, a global network of peer mentoring groups for environmental leaders from countries around the world. Ruth does her best to practice what she preaches. And over the years, she and her family had a lot of fun experimenting with ways of living as lightly as possible, producing their own meat through a pig cooperative, though she doesn't eat meat now, growing her own vegetables and supporting a local organic vegetable grower, installing solar panels, thinking through how they holidayed, switching to an electric car, and moving away from single-use plastic, to name just some of the things they've done. The green living pages come out of what they learned. Ruth, it's a delight for Forrest and I to be able to interview today. Forrest and I have really been looking forward to this chat. And so thank you for being a part of this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to connect with you again, Christine.
It is. It's been quite a while, hasn't it? Yeah. Well, and I was trying to think when we first met. And I think it's almost 30 years ago. I remember sitting, I think, in your front room with your then husband, Greg, and with Pete Greig and with some others, and talking about the things that you were all becoming very passionate about. And since then, I've followed much of your career through the writing of your books, L is for Lifetime and Just Living in particular. And then, followed along
Christine,
with your...
let me stop you because it's L is for Lifestyle.
Oh, Lifestyle, I'm sorry. Yes, I did have that written down and I didn't. Yeah. And then I participated in, as much as possible, the Giving Up Plastic for Lent 1 year.
Yeah.
And, I have followed your career in Arosha and Tear Fund, know less about what you're doing at the moment, but just am fascinated by the journey that you have taken. So, and the way that your faith has played into that. So can you tell us a little more about that journey and, how you got into it and how you've maintained your passion in particular over all these years?
Yes, gosh. Well, it was actually in this same room where I'm sitting that you and Tom and the others you mentioned sat around the table and we had dinner together. I'm still in the same house, so have been here, 31 years. So it probably was just a bit less than that you came round. So really rooted in the community here, which is a lovely thing. And what got me switched on to the kind of issues that I've pursued through my adult life were firstly an emphasis on issues of poverty and social justice, and a realization that this God who I'd worshipped all through my childhood was a God of justice and was calling us as Christians to be people who spend themselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, as Isaiah 58 tells us. So it kind of started off really rooted in a strong understanding of poverty and social justice and the call on God's people to be engaged with those things. And then it morphed into an understanding that the God I worshipped, as well as being a God of justice, was the Lord of all creation. And it actually came through a little book that I read when I was at university called Whose Earth, that talked about what the environment says about creation care, about caring for the environment. And it's the first time really that I'd seen it in that way. And it was kind of like a second conversion. I just realized there was a part of my faith that was missing. It wasn't that my faith was wrong, but it was a bit too narrow and it needed to open up to include the whole natural world and not only humans. And so it started from there. And I began exploring the biblical side and the theology. For me, as a Christian, that faith side is really important. It kind of has to make sense biblically for it to make sense to me. So I started exploring it theologically and realized, well, if this is the case, that God cares about this world and wants us to care for it too, then it really needs to work itself out in practice. This can't be something I talk about and preach about. I actually have to live it. Otherwise, I'm a hypocrite. And so it began from there. So I started looking at what can I do in order to enable my life to do as little damage as possible to this world. And, this is 30 odd years ago. So way before a lot of the things that we take for granted were normal things. And so it's just gone from that. And somehow, in God's grace, the passion has stayed with me, and I have remained absolutely committed to trying to live these things out and trying to help other people to understand why it's so important and such a part of our faith to care for the natural world.
Wonderful.
Ruth, it's interesting. Christine's husband, Tom, often speaks about his introduction to really Christians' responsibility for caring for the earth as a second conversion as well. He marks that moment.
He does.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah, and his, of course, was Earth Day, 1970. That was his second conversion. He talks about that, yes.
That's amazing. I had no idea.
Whenever we talk to people who really have serious commitments to earth care, invariably their work is grounded in their relationship to nature. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about your relationship to creation and even some of the early influences or experiences that help to create that relationship.
Yeah, I think it comes partly back to my childhood. So although I wasn't brought up really understanding a Christian view of creation care, I was brought up with a mum, a dad as well, but with a mum who absolutely loved the natural world. She studied biology at university, and that was actually it's her study of biology that really rooted her Christian faith, as she studied what was happening biologically, and she just thought there must be something behind this, and so that rooted her faith. And we couldn't, as a child, I couldn't sit outside in the garden. I couldn't go for a walk. Couldn't do anything with her without her saying, "Isn't the Lord amazing to create all these beautiful things?" So I was brought up with an innate love of beauty and of beauty found in the natural world, and lived in a village in a sort of semi-rural setting on the outskirts of London, so not completely rural, but there were fields behind us, and I would take myself out with my dog. I'd take a book, pack up a picnic, take myself out for the day, go walk the fields, sit in the farm behind the house, had a big barn with a massive haystack, and I would go sit in there with the cows and read my book and have my picnic and eat my sandwiches and talk to the cows. So there was always that love of the natural world that was in me. And then I would say that for quite a while, the environmental side, as it grew in me as an adult, possibly was fairly theoretical around a love. I still love nature, but I think it's been in more recent years that I've actually discovered a deeper appreciation of the natural world and a deeper understanding of how much I am connected with that. I am part of nature. So it's not nature's over there and there's me. I am natural. I am a part of the natural world. I am a part of creation. It's not that you've got creation and human beings. We are part of creation. And reading and spending time outside and realizing that in many ways my understanding of nature, I think, has been quite sterile. And I haven't appreciated the agency that is in the natural world itself. The birds can sing their own praises of God. They're not just there to provide a nice sound for me to listen to. And I think there's so much more in nature and in how nature responds to God and responds to itself and to what's going on around it, around her. I think there's so much more that I didn't realize and that I've been discovering, and that deeper connection to God. So I've still got a long way to go and a lot more.
Don't we all? It's interesting, as you were speaking, I was thinking kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I remember reading that during COVID, when all the man-made noises were greatly reduced, that the bird song was louder.
Yes,
and
that's right.
I think it's fascinating to me that the very environment we create, the man-made environment, actually reduces the ability of God's other creatures often to praise God in the way that God intends.
Yeah.
So,
I went for a walk with my youngest daughter during lockdown, and we went into, I live in a small city, and we went into the city and crossed over a road that's normally very, very busy. And there was not a single car on the road. And we stood in the middle of the road. It was sunset, and there was a blackbird singing loudly, other than that, absolute quiet. And I said to her, remember this, you will never again stand on this road with no cars. This is an extraordinary moment. And the only noise was the blackbird singing. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, Ruth, what strikes me about your response is it actually called up a story in me about my grandma. We lived in a very urban context, and whenever we would stay with my grandma, we'd walk around a lake in a local park. And always she would stop and say, listen, right? Listen, and what do you hear? I might say, cars, and we'll listen again, right? And so she would teach me to listen to the subtext, right? She would teach me to listen to the details of context. Or we'd stand on the shore and the same thing. What do you see? And my first answer was always wrong, or at least not complete. And then she would say, but look again, right? And then I would notice the tadpoles. And then she'd tell me the story of, the life cycle of a frog. But it strikes me that while we all may have this propensity for appreciating nature, I think it does take influences of the adults in our life when we're kids to activate that, right? And so the story of your mom doing that for you really reminds me of that responsibility we have. And I think about our listeners, who all are practically minded and all want to have an influence in earth care. I think that is not something to overlook. It's our responsibility to the next generation to help them to learn how to see, to help them to learn how to hear. That in itself is such a powerful way that we can work for earth care and earth advocacy.
And often, or sometimes, it's about the other way around. It's about children see and experience more naturally, and we can dull that down in them. We don't want them to get dirty. We don't want them to graze their knees by climbing the trees, or we don't want them to get their clothes dirty by splashing in the puddles or
picking up bugs that we don't like the look of.
Yes, or they might more naturally talk to the animals or to the birds, and we get that out of them. So there's lots that we can learn from the other way as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, obviously, earth care is something that is very important for the three of us. But why do you think that it matters for all followers of Jesus?
Because it is so much a part of the scriptural narrative that we base our lives on as followers of Jesus. Centrally, I think of Colossians 1:19-20, where we are told that Jesus' blood was shed on the cross to reconcile all things to God. Now, I read that for so many years and read that Jesus' blood was shed on the cross to reconcile all people to God. And I just, my glasses just naturally read that. And I still believe that. I do still believe that Jesus' blood was shed on the cross to reconcile people to God. But actually, it was quite a shock when I realized that that wasn't what it said. It said all things. So the God we worship, the Lord who we serve is, yes, absolutely interested in people, but has a wider remit, and salvation is about the reconciliation of all things. And you see that all the way through the scriptures. So in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, the scholar Chris Wright would talk about this triangle of relationships of God, the people, and the land. And it's always that together. It's never only about God and the people. It's also about the land. It's about how the people live in the land and whether they live well. And the land responds accordingly to how the people live. So when the people aren't living well, when they're living sinfully, and by sinfully is meant, according to the prophets, not taking care of other people, not being interested in justice and releasing people from oppression. Where the people are living sinfully, then the land revolts. There's environmental degradation, and Amos 8 is a great example of that. And then, as we see in Isaiah, when the people return to God, then the land responds. The trees, which is the right way round? The trees clap their hands and the fields sing. I'm sure I've got that the wrong way round, but the land responds. So all the way through, it's God, the people, and the land. It's never only God and people. And starting at the beginning, we are told that God looked at all that God had made and said it's very good. So this isn't a denial. Our Christian faith is not about denying material reality and saying we should only be interested in so-called spiritual things and we're going to be whisked off to heaven when we die. The Christian faith, following the Hebrew Jewish faith, is physical, it's earthy. Matter matters to God, as the scientist David Wilkinson says. And so this world is vitally important to the God who we worship, to Jesus Christ. And therefore, as people who love Jesus and want to worship Jesus, we want to take care of that which is so precious to him.
Amen.
So it isn't an optional extra for a few keen greenies on one side of the church. This is a central part of what the good news, the gospel of Jesus, is all about.
Well, it's interesting to me, that filter that we put on things, because the scripture I think of is John 3:16. It doesn't say for God so loved people. It says for God so loved the world, that he gave his only son. And we kind of interpret that again as though it's only people. And yet one of those scriptures, the first scripture many of us use, embraces the whole of creation, I think.
Yeah,
and
the whole cosmos, the Greek, as you know. The Greek for world is cosmos. It's the whole cosmos.
Yes. Yeah.
Ruth, speaking of a more holistic perspective, I'm really intrigued with the fact that you are very much involved with issues of earth care, but also with issues of social justice and the rights and needs of the poor. I have been a professor of community development, and I will say that my students, especially from a developing world context, have taught me so much about how to think about environmental issues and how to think of them with more dimension than maybe Westerners are likely to think about them. And just to give you an example, I was with one of my students in Uganda, and we were in Lira, and that day they happened to be planting trees along the street, which in Lira was not a common thing. So I saw it as a really good thing. More trees is always good. But he seemed kind of upset about it. And afterwards, I asked him, what's the problem with planting trees on the street? And his response was really eye-opening for me. He said, those trees could be fruit trees, and those trees could be sustaining the poor, of which we have many in Lira. And I think, just moments like that have taught me that earth care takes on new dimensions in different contexts, right? That we think about it differently. I mean, in many contexts, earth care could be seen as a luxury, when set against the urgency of human need. I'm wondering what your experience has been in terms of that reframing of earth care or the climate crisis from contexts of poverty or displacement even.
Yeah, my experience is that earth care and human care, and I should probably add sea care as well. It's not only about the land, you need to remember the seas as well, that all of this is totally integrated. So I often say when I'm speaking, you can't care for people without thinking about the land they live off, the seas they fish in, the air that they breathe, the type of food that they're eating. You can't care for people without thinking about the natural environment that they're a part of and the impact that has on them. And you can't care for the natural world without thinking about the people, the human species that inhabit those spaces and the impact that people have on them. And when it comes to the big issues of our day, like the climate crisis, like plastic pollution, issues of human justice and environmental care are completely woven in. You can't separate them. I've just come back from Iraq, where I was with as part of my work with Embrace the Middle East. And Embrace the Middle East, you would think of as a human poverty focused organization. It works with local Christians in the Middle East as they supporting local Christian organizations as they tackle poverty and injustice. increasingly we're seeing that the work we're supporting has an environmental side. So I've just been up in the very north of Iraq, with Syria to my left and Turkey over the other side of the mountains up ahead. Just a remarkable place, visiting pretty remote rural villages, subsistence farming, and village after village after village told us that the big issue they're facing is that they're running out of water. So Iraq is the fifth most climate vulnerable country in the world, and human poverty is being caused by an environmental crisis. And because of the environmental crisis, if they're running out of water, can't grow their crops, they will have no choice but to leave and to try to find other places to live. So the migration crisis, the refugee crisis that we're facing, is fueled, amongst other things, by environmental crises, by the climate crisis. So all of these things are wrapped up, and you can't separate them. So we have to take a holistic approach as we look at them.
Now, one of the other things that you talk a lot about is simplicity, and living simply, I think, is a value that you've certainly lived out in your life. And so I'm wondering, first, again, why do you think it's important for Christians, not just yourself, but for Christians generally? And how have you lived it out in your life?
I think it's an important response because it is beholden on us to ask ourselves, how can we live in today's society in a way that does as little damage as possible to this world and to all who live in it, both the human creatures and the wider than human creatures? And we know that our high levels of consumerism are causing immense damage. We know that we are living beyond our means. If everybody lived as the average American does, we would need 6 planets in order to support that lifestyle. It's a bit over 3 planets for someone from the UK. We don't have 6 or 3 planets, and we are consuming more than our fair share of the world's resources. And that is contributing not only to climate change, but to many, many other problems. And so the question for us is, how do we live in that situation? How do we live well? And I think the answer is that we live more simply. We consume less. And when we do consume, we think about how we're consuming and what emissions are being, and we think about what emissions are being caused by that. What's the word I'm looking for? What emissions are being produced?
Yes.
By that. So we think about what emissions are being produced by that. And all of us need to live in ways whereby we are consuming less of the world's resources. And for me, that was a natural side of discovering the impact that my life and on all of us is having on other people. And I didn't really know that it was called simplicity. I just wanted to live in as careful and as kind a way as possible. And then I discovered that other people had called it simplicity. And so I then started reading and thinking about this concept and thinking, how can I live more simply on this earth?
Yeah, it really is important. And it's interesting because one of the things I find, because in some ways we think we live simply, but that's comparing ourselves to other wealthy Americans. And, even when I come to Britain or I go to Australia, their idea of simplicity is much simpler, I find, that mine tends to be. And then, of course, I go to Africa or somewhere like that. Boy, we don't have to tell them about simple living. They have to live simply and have a lot to teach us about what that means and, kind of our tendency to throw things out when they don't work anymore and things like that can contribute to the overconsumption that we're so much a part of. It's a huge challenge. It really is.
It is. And I think that global comparison is really useful. We have a tendency as a human species always to look up the ladder, so to speak. And it can be very helpful to look down the ladder and to see how other people are living. And when it comes to simplicity, do you know there are no hard and fast rules? The Bible doesn't say you can have one television but not two, or drive this sort of car but not that sort of car, So what I have found is important or what I found is helpful is talking and not trying to just come up with my own ideas, but chatting with others in the way that you do, is you talk to friends from Australia or from the UK. And so we can help each other to think through what sort of things are appropriate. And we can learn from other people.
Mm-hmm.
We can learn from what other people do. And I've done that so much, and I've seen other people and the way they've lived and thought, oh, I could do that too. And yeah, that's a good idea. So all of these things are important from a faith perspective, I would say, to be talking about in our churches, that we have these conversations and we're not left on our own to try to work it out.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what type of response do you get when you speak in churches to this message?
Yeah, pretty good. So I guess I'm only, by virtue of being invited to speak in a church.
Yes.
I'm not turning up randomly at a church and forcing myself on them. So I think by virtue of being invited to speak, it will be a church where there is some openness. I have been speaking, writing, communicating on issues of social justice and environmental care for a good 30 years or so. And I have seen things change. In the beginning, those 30 years ago, and I'm sure for you thinking back further, was definitely not understood and thought of as pretty weird. And it wasn't understood in the church. From a UK perspective, and I do sometimes speak outside of the UK as well, but particularly from a UK perspective, I have seen things change.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been involved with was launching a program called Eco Church, which is an award scheme to help churches get engaged with caring for the natural world. In England and Wales, there are now 7,500 churches that are signed up to Eco Church and are actively engaged, which is amazing.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Really growing. What I would say is, I think in recent years, I would say probably post-pandemic, I think we're beginning to go backwards, certainly as societies. And whereas before the pandemic, we really recognized that we were in a climate emergency. Now, and I know you can speak about this so much more from your context, climate has become increasingly politicized, increasingly being used as a political football that is so unhelpful. And however we can, wherever we can, we need to resist that and say this isn't a political issue. This is such a crisis situation. Wherever we're from on the political spectrum, we need to come together and look at how to act and how to respond.
Both Christine and I, in her podcast, Liturgical Rebels, and my podcast, Earth Keepers, we really want to encourage people to do more. And not just to do more, but to do things that make sense in their lives, that are in sync with the things that they have to offer. What we do find, though, is sometimes people feel a bit guilty in terms of not being able to do enough, right? I'll speak very personally. I have until yesterday had 2 jobs, working both for Circlewood, but also for Pacific Rim Institute. And I'm coming off of that experience, feeling pretty burnt out. So this is really a personal question. And I do have some guilt that, even in the midst of my working 2 environmental jobs, I felt like I could always be doing more. I look at your life and you're engaged with earthkeeping in so many ways, from writing to activism to speaking. And honestly, it takes my breath away. I just think, oh, how can anyone do so much, right? And I know that that's a silly way to look at it. I'm also inspired by your example. But I'm wondering, for those listeners who maybe feel like they can't do enough or they're not doing enough, how do you speak to people who do actually care enough to want to invest their lives, but also are not quite sure how to do the appropriate amount that suits their context and their abilities?
Mm. Well, I firstly want to encourage you and say, if you were able to travel across the Atlantic and come to my home, it wouldn't take you very long to see the things that I'm not doing that I should be. None of us are perfect. And I, along with you, have had to learn that I can't do everything, and instead to focus on the things that I can do. So if I think back to, I wish we were in a room together and I could illustrate it. If I was here and I wanted to get to there on the other side of the room, to get to there is a massive jump, a bigger jump than I could do in one go. But I just take one step, I do one thing, and then I do one more thing, and then I do one thing. And gradually, over the years, I've got further along here, so that I now look back and think, whoa, goodness me, how much has changed? But that hasn't changed by me taking everything on and doing everything together. It's just been one thing after another. So I would encourage you and others to think about one thing that you could do to change. It might be in the area of the food that you eat. It might be about your travel. It might be something to do with single-use plastics or the energy in your home. Just choose one thing. And when that has become second nature to you and just a natural part of how you live, then choose something else and do something else. And always remember that you cannot be perfect. We cannot be perfect in this world because we are constrained by governments and business. And so what I would want to say is really important that we don't take all the responsibility on ourselves and we don't take all the guilt on ourselves, because actually the big responsibility lies with government and business. They are the ones that can put into place the big policies and practices that will then allow us to do the right thing, to do the things that we want to do more easily. If I brought very cunningly brought some of my books, let me put them here so I can reach them more easily. From a practical side, this L is for lifestyle is a great way to do that step-by-step thing. Each chapter is really short and it finishes with 2 or 3 very clear action points. So you could just take one chapter, do one thing, and then when you're doing that, you could take the next thing. So this is here really so that it doesn't overwhelm you and to be a resource. So I would focus on what you can do and don't worry about what you can't.
Yeah, those are wise and comforting words. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I think there are a lot of people out there who feel overwhelmed, by all the possibilities. I know one of the things that's overwhelmed me recently is being on a couple of different medications that all come in single-use plastic vials, and there's no alternative, and so I feel guilty, and yet they're medications I need. And, and
in the UK, we do have ways of recycling medical things like that.
Here you can recycle medical pill bottles, but not, as far as I know, the vials at this point in time.
But again, when I say that is a classic example of where the responsibility is put on the consumer, and you're made to feel guilty. Actually, the producer should be the one feeling guilty that they're providing it in something that you find difficult to recycle. So
Thank you.
But it does beg the question, though, is all right, let's say that the responsibility does lie with those powers. Do we still have any way to influence those powers? Right? I mean, if that's really going to be a great impact, how do we actually make that impact?
Yes.
Yeah, we do. And we do that by getting together with others is probably the best thing. Join our voices with other people. So we won't be able to make a difference and campaign and do advocacy on every single issue that there is. And I recommend you focus down on the things that are really important to you, and then find some other people or some organizations that are also involved in that issue and join with them. From a Christian perspective, I really think that we are all called to use our voices to speak out. We are called to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, and preferably go a step further and give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. But we are called to speak up for the destitute and for the widow and the stranger and so on. And so using our voice within advocacy and campaigning, I think, is a very important part of our faith.
Wonderful.
And we make a difference.
What comes to mind as you're speaking is, I agree with you that there's power when we join our voices to others. You know, mobilizing people is the difficult part of it, though. But when you think about the church has already mobilized people. It's already gathered people around common cause and purpose and values. So it would make perfect sense then to use that community or to join that community in terms of advocating for these larger intractable issues, it seems to me.
Absolutely. As the church, we are a massive worldwide movement. And as a massive worldwide movement, we have the potential to get together to do an awful lot of harm. And we might say that we have seen that. We also have the potential to get together to do a huge amount of good. If we can speak together on issues around environmental care and caring for people living in poverty, we could make a massive difference. Yes. I sometimes think of the church as being like this sleeping giant, and it feels to me like it's just beginning to wake up. And if we could really rouse it together, we could make a huge amount of good.
And of course, that applies to any religious community, right?
Yeah. 80% of the world's population adheres to the 5 major faiths. So you're right. This isn't only a Christian thing. People of faith together rose up and acted, both lived out and spoke around caring for this world and for people in poverty. There's a massive movement there.
That's a very encouraging kind of word and exciting word, I think, to end on. And this has just been wonderful to chat to you, Ruth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, a pleasure to do this for Earth Day. It's great.
Yes. Yep. No, it will come out at least on Liturgical Rebels. It'll come out probably the day after Earth Day. And I know Forrest will produce it at a different date, but that'll spread it out.
This is Monday's episode.
It's Monday's. His will come out first. So.
Well, shall I say something different then?
No, you're okay.
No, this is great. Thank you so much, Ruth. In today's conversation on Liturgical Rebels, Forrest Inslee and I engaged with Ruth Valerio, exploring her journey into earth care and the integration of faith and environmentalism. Ruth shared her personal experiences and theological insights, emphasizing the interconnectedness of social justice and environmental issues. The discussion highlighted the importance of simplicity in living, the role of the church in advocating for earth care, and the need for individual action in addressing the climate crisis. In the next episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will take a very different focus. I will be in conversation with Kevin Sweeney, author of The Cosmic Christ and Concrete Jesus. Kevin tells us that during a time when doubt and deconstruction seem to be making all of the headlines, it is his desire for people to not only see why he's still a Christian, but also to see all of the life in Christ beyond their own movement through new stages of faith. I hope that people will not only change their beliefs, but reimagine a faith that is not defined by what they believe, but how well they love and are loved, he told me. This is an exciting and challenging book. He is particularly inspired by the mystics and the Black prophetic tradition who are his guides. Why? Because in his own journey, the mystics gave him the cosmic Christ and the Black prophetic tradition gave him the concrete Jesus. Kevin Sweeney is also chaplain for hospice care and currently lives in Honolulu with his wife Christine and their two kids, True and Michaela. I am Christine Sine, the author of Celtic Advent, Following an Unfamiliar Path, and The Gift of Wonder. My other books include Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening, and To Garden with God. I also write regularly on Substack. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, Blue Sky, or Facebook.